All right, welcome guys. I got Thomas Jockin with me. We're going to be talking about the body.
Um, Another way to talk about this idea. So another way I try to explain this is this idea of, because Aristotle uses note about like a vessel holding wine. He uses these examples in physics about this. But to summarize it, let's say you go out and it's snowing outside. It was snowing recently where I was. So it was snowing. You go outside, you make a snow angel.
Right.
Make a snow angel. Your pattern exists in the snow, right? It's a separation in place. So you as a substantial form made the snow angel, and now you're separated from it. And the continued existence of that snow angel is conditional. It's temporary. It's conditional. Because if the snow melts or something, add more snow comes in, that snow angel is gone. No longer exists. So this is an example of a privational form. It's lacking the substance of the thing that made the form, that made the pattern. There's only shape. There's no form. Versus the object, the entity that made the snow person, the snow angel, continues to exist, right? And is not. It has a continued existence, thus notice the distinction of separation is an important aspect of it, and also lack is showing up. Also, that language. That's why I think occupy shows up, because you have to use that kind of language to explain why do angels have bodies. They don't have they're spiritual entities. Just use the Aquinas point. He has to explain. Aquinas talks about this. Angels do not have bodies in the normal sense. They occupy matter. They have a body. You can also use this kind of language to talk about waves of an ocean. Technically, they have a sine pattern, a sine wave in them. The water molecules are arranged in a pattern that occupies a certain space. So, but these are not necessarily substances in the hardest of sense of a body. They're not a body per se because they don't have this requirement.
So it's like the way you're saying this to me is like space is like the traces of where the body goes, like where life is.
Yes.
In like, even like the example of, falling in the snow or making a snowman or making a, whatever. It's like wherever there is a sort of source of life, a body, it traces out space.
Yes.
Versus space doesn't trace out bodies.
Exactly. There's an arrow of causation. Yeah.
Right. Actually, I'm gonna write that down.
You want to know a real shocker? I've been racing on this for weeks now. There's a very important note from Aristotle he says about this. So there's Elenchia, which is Elenchia has telos in it, so it's really interesting for that reason. But it's a variation of Anageia. And anyone who's Aristotelian knows when you see Anageia, you should immediately get your ears up immediately, because anything that's going to be said about Anageia is a huge deal, because it's actual reality. And it's the cause of potentiality for Aristotle. Actuality is prior to potential. So Anageia is before Dumasis, because things that have a capacity has to be given that capacity from something. So, and notice I made that line about a body is the first Elenchia, enactment of a telos, of the form that has the capacity for life. So that sets up a kind of life. Now the thing about life, here's a really important thing. So when we see a body, because it is a body, because it has activated we use the word activated or enacted life, right? So this body is occupying a space and has life. It's occupied, it's showing it, it's revealing it to you. But here's the line now from Aristotle. I've been racing about this. The Anageia of nous is life. So I can reverse that order. Life is the Anageia, is the enactment of nous.
Life is the enactment of nous. Okay.
And that's incredibly shocking from anyone who studies Aristotle, because nous gets translated as intellect or mind, but that is a very it's like how soul psyche, same move. It's like we've collapsed it into, or even idea from Plato. These are psychological states of mind, and that's not necessarily what's going on here.
Right.
It's very difficult to try to paint out what is going on here, but it is, I'll put it in the most simplest of part, because I bring this up because, so let me first point out a very important aspect. So there's logos, word, account, reason, and then there's nous, right? So what's going on is that logos is actually the operation of, it's a faculty of nous, right? They have interaction where nous works in apprehensions. It's the first recognition of reality. And it's never doubted and it's never false. This is a claim from Aristotle, and as anyone who's an Aristotelian stands on that position. You cannot ever have falsehood. The falsehood shows up in in logos or the application in reasoning. So if you use apprehension, the trifold model of cognition, we have apprehension, which is the operation of nous. Then there's judgment, so it's the application, and then there's classification. So that's the kind of syllogistic combination of major and minor premises and action that can lead to new apprehensions. So it is possible for that to happen, but that's the ecosystem that occurs in thought and cognition. Nous being basically when we see life, what Aristotle's getting at with this is that whenever we see life, we are encountering nous, like in true reality. That is, and because this is important because Aristotle says nous is not an organ of the body.
Right.
Not like, and this is, so actually the Deleuzian line of an organ without body, or a body without organs, excuse me, a body without organs. Where's that coming from? I'm not a Deleuzian scholar, but I would probably bet if we drew out where that line came from, it's a riff on nous from Aristotle. Because that's kind of the point, is that a lot of this, as you notice, this question of does the body think? Aristotle would say yes. And in fact, a lot of human error and vice, using Aquinas' line, and sin, it comes from the failure of the body in some way. Thus thought is, and actually this is some of the Aristotelian scholars really do believe we must have bodies to think, because we work with the phantasms. We're generated by the body in the imagination, and then the intellect operates on it. So thus, from Aristotelian's accounts, we're saying here, nous does not interact with reality directly. At least this way we have for humans. For humans, we need the body to give you the image datum, the datum from the common sense, paired and then those patterns as phantasms captured in memory with the estimated power and imagination and the appetites interacting all with each other to then be worked on by the intellect, by nous. And that leads to us enacting. And then there's another line from Eudemian ethics that the instrument of nous is virtue, arete.
Instrument of nous is virtue.
So the word aragon, right, instrument, shows up. It shows up both in the discussion of a body and in this idea of arete, virtue.
Instrument of nous. Yeah. So this is really interesting because, like, I feel like you're making connections for me, like how Heidegger leaped to where he leaped, because he was apparently he read Aristotle for 20 years, right? Something like that.
His dissertation is on Duns Scotus.
Right. But I know he spent a lot of time with like Aristotle. So actually, I don't know if he read Aristotle for 20 years, but I know that he recommended to students that they read Aristotle for 20 years before. Like,
he's right. I mean, I totally agree with that. It's like, and I still got 10 more years to do with this guy.
But the way you gave this account, from bodies tracing out space, body means the capacity for life. Then life is the enactment of nous, but nous is not an organ of the body, but more or less a kind of showing the idea that the body thinks, and is also what allows us to have recognition of reality, via the other faculties that you talked about. But what's really interesting as a connection to Heidegger was Heidegger says, and I was like, I'm wondering if this is like his slight like insertion of nous. I'm not sure, but I wonder if it is. He says, when Dasein, when we are in the world, we already have an understanding of being.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like when he says that, he's alluding to nous, which I know this is complicated. The reason why this is complicated, and it's not going to be one for one, is because fundamentally we're talking about two disjointed methods. Heidegger's going from phenomenology, description. Aristotle is not coming from necessarily a descriptive point of view, a phenomenological point of view. But it made me suspicious in the sense of that, Heidegger seems to invert some of Aristotle's premises,
Mm-hmm.
right? Actualities, what's more important than potential, it seems. Whereas Heidegger is saying, we are being potential, and that is what we are. And that's what, and he says that quote, potential is higher than actuality, or whatever.
If I can intervene, just to be fair, I think Aristotle would admit this. He says there's a difference between perspective, in the sense of, he points it out, is that from our perspective, potential seems first and actually comes to be afterwards. But Aristotle's what he does is he basically builds from the arguments he does in metaphysics and physics and everything, all those other texts, to show that that basically using modes of deduction, he shows that it must be the case that actuality is prior to potential. But that's the point. So but he does fully admit that in time, it appears that potential is first.
Right.
And there's fair lines about, and this is a layer development because of this. This is actually very important, because this idea of nous and the problem of where is it if it's not a bodily organ.
Right.
This is incredibly important for any theist, because especially basically what is Aristotle's God is nous. That's absolutely, I think it's basically every Aristotelian scholar would agree with that. The Aristotelian God is nous. That leads to a very important question. And this is actually it's an open question. It's still, to this day, we don't have a definitive answer. Is there one nous that we all participate in? Or is there a distinction between the divine nous and the nous in human beings? That's a fundamental problem that is not clearly answered. There's language used about what's called the active and the passive intellect nous, and the agent nous, or intellect, when you translate into a more scholastic language about it. What's generally kind of worked out is that human beings have agent intellect with a possible intellect, but God is the actual intellect. It's basically thinking about thought in full actuality. They kind of give you a paraphrasing about it. It's basically those moments of apprehension that we get passively, potentially, God gets all the time. That's basically what God's doing at all moments, at all times. It's kind of intense if you actually really think about it. If you can only imagine that every single moment is like that is a moment of great, shocking insight or revelation or revealing. Think about God. He sees that all the time. That's what he's seeing. That's what he's apprehending at all moments. It's kind of amazing. This is a thought experiment, but just as a point, just to think through, just the kind of mitigate what Heidegger is getting at. He's talking from a phenomenology perspective, is about the individual subject engaging. There's definitely some language. I mean, actually kind of fun, as you know, my essay in my Halcyon course, where I joined in on Heidegger, I was very critical of Heidegger, because I was reading this and I basically, on a question of substance, and I say, well, what if you're basically saying that there seems, he's pointing, using in the question of technology, he's pointing out there seems to be a qualitative difference between the modes of technology, even though they all have the same essence. There's an essence technology, and there's been a break-in operation of using examples of the windmill versus a dam, and this idea of the enfrainment and standing in reserve, right? Those two major concepts he brings up. And that seems to be colored with some kind of more of kind of valuation about that there's a change of being and there's something wrong with that. Because using language, I say it because of the language of challenging, like you're squeezing, challenging. This is the language of violence, right? A kind of contrary to nature kind of operation. But I challenge to say, I don't see from the text we read in that course, not as Heidegger, I'm not a Heidegger scholar. I was pointing out what exactly is the grounds to justify that questioning or stance of valuation about the change of being. This doesn't seem like any, especially when it seems that an operation of thought is just as good as any other. I don't want to be cute, but basically this kind of when subject is substance, that kind of move happens. It seems that then anything's free to go. We could do what we want at any time in any way, because that's fine. Not an issue. And the problem, anyone with a classical view of substance would say, no, the justification. And by the way, actually, by the way, this is relevant. It's relevant because of things like human rights, human dignity. It's actually, I mean, a lot of Aristotelian scholars like McIntyre in discussions had pointed out that dignity is a completely empty concept. It has no standing. It's an attempt to try to solve the problem of losing Aristotelian metaphysics. If you lose substance metaphysics, the way Aristotle talks about it, you have to, but yet you still want human rights. You want to protect human beings, that we have certain obligations to one another. There's a certain way we should treat one another that has real standing. That is not arbitrary judicial law, fiat, command, but something legitimate. You have the dignities uses the argument. McIntyre says, no, it doesn't work. What should be, he says it's, and he's correct. It's justice. Justice would be the way you would talk about it, not dignity. You would not have to invent a new concept to address this issue. You'll be an issue of justice, but you can't do it because justice has no standing anymore ontologically. If there is no substances with natures, that by definition, violence is the enactment against nature. When you do something contrary to nature, that is violent. That's the metaphysical import from Aristotle and metaphysics. So if you could only comprehend violence by using having a measure, literally a measure of reference of nature, and nature is coming from the substance of the entity in question. Thus, that's why Heidegger can make a claim of a change of being in the dam, like of the river. He's correct. He's absolutely correct about that. But the point I point out is that especially with his language of challenging it and demand and this other stuff, and the kind of positing, he says in the essay, he points out like this is going to happen to human beings. Human beings are going to be converted into standing reserve. Totally correct. Totally reasonable analysis. I'm just saying from the equipment of Heidegger, I'm left saying, and what? It seems like it is you have an issue about it. Congratulations. But I don't think that's not persuasive in any way, besides that you don't like it. But anyways, this is just a circle back to that essay to point out that this operation of nous has a really interesting aspect to it because of how do humans relate to God in that sense? Because that's the point. Because also Aristotle says it is the divine element in us, and the thing that ought to be enacted the most. This is partly why he says contemplation is the highest good for human beings, because you're in the activity of nous when you're doing that.
So this is interesting, right? The Heidegger thing. So I believe you're correct on Heidegger, but I think what I disagree with most of the time when people talk about Heidegger is the basically where they disagree is where I would say Like that's the limits of Heidegger. But like, so for example, and like Luber and I talk about this all the time, like you can't make, in my opinion, a political philosophy out of Heidegger. You can't make an ethics out of Heidegger. Why? It's precisely because of the very limits of phenomenology. He's describing. Now, what's really interesting as I'm going through Being and Time is that there are moments when he's describing, and it's as if he's almost saying, we should be doing this. Like it almost has like a sort of moral command to it. But the way I interpret Heidegger is that I say he's diagnostic, right? Which can kind of give a nice like fitting to why there seems to be like this sensation of him calling moral attention to something, but he actually doesn't have an answer to it. He just has like I'm describing it to you. This is what's happening. And we have to like do something about this because this is my diagnosis. This is what I think is going to happen. There is no moral like substance to how can we go about that and why should we go about that. It's simply the description of his situation, like the situation that he feels can be phenomenologically described as this change of the state of being. So that's fundamentally like, and this is actually why Heidegger can be a Nazi, by the way. It's precisely because the question of being does not, it's he's always approaching it not from an ethical point of view. That's the problem. He thinks that, and this is what's interesting, right? I would say, because like Aristotle, like his metaphysics directly connected to ethics. Mm-hmm. It's like top down. There's no way it cannot be connected to ethics. It is top down. Heidegger, it's not like that. It's completely disjointed, meaning that he doesn't even answer what an ethics is like other than describing. The most that you can gather from Heidegger, in my opinion, of like an ethics would be the fact that he says in his description, and just by virtue of his description, he's saying that we are not a what, but a who. And I feel like that already carries a kind of like ethical or moral command in itself. But again, this is like an argument that some Heidegger scholars have, where it's like they say there is no ethics in Heidegger, so we shouldn't derive one. I'm sort of like in that position. There is some that say, yes, there is implicit within Heidegger an ethics, which is why they argue like, you can have like a Heidegger Marxism, and so
Javier,
on.
can I ask you a question related to that? Because in the reading, in the group, in the Halcyon group, there were critics of my essay. It was Johannes, right, the lead instructor, right, as well as another individual. I forgot his name, but he was a very informed Heidegger scholar, looked like, or reader. They're, and I'd like to hear, since you've been reading more by the Heidegger scholars, and I haven't, right. I've been busy playing with Aristotle. I would appreciate your assessment on this. Their challenge, both of them, was on this question of freedom, which ties in, I think, with your note about potentiality for Heidegger. There have been some, like, for example, forgot his name. He's the author of Time Energy. I actually read his text, Time Energy.
Oh, you read that? Oh,
yeah. Cool. It's an easy read, very quick. So it's very easy to do that. He did posit, it seems to be a pattern. I'm not sure it's a Heideggerian stance or or none of us Marxist. I think Heidegger, or a Heidegger or a Hegel position as the human being as the entity with potential to be. So what that means is that things that allow for more maximum potential to be realized is good. So there's a moral claim, like it actually operates exactly what I'm talking about. What is the nature of man? What is our substance? Our substance is the enactment of possibility. It's our range of possibility that man can be anything.
Right.
As a
Right.
result, things that, and then if that is our nature, things that hinder our range of possibility is violence against our possibility, against our nature. That is violence and ought to be removed so that our nature can flourish and we can have the living activity that is human. So to be human is to be free.
Right.
That's my synopsis of what our colleagues who challenged me on my essay would critique to me. And what seems to be the best argument for a moral claim in Heidegger is this argument of freedom. Do you see a correlation? Is that what you see in your literature review or assessments?
I mean, like, so, like, yes, but like, let me. I might slightly disagree, but they are correct. Like, so Heidegger, it's more of an emphasis issue, like, in my opinion. Like, Heidegger cares about possibility. Okay, the problem is he doesn't give us an ethos of possibility. Okay, you can all Heidegger is helpful for, in my opinion, is how, as a fish, do you realize that you're in a fish tank? How do you realize that what you think is your world is actually not your world, but a fish tank? Heidegger's really good at doing that. He's really good at helping you realize that actually the very construction of the meaning of being is actually a possibility of a meaning of being. So that means that you are actually a fish in a fish tank. Now, the problem is, here's the thing. He doesn't give you an ethos concerning possibilities of the meaning of being. That means it's completely open. That means that even though this is freedom in, like, the most, you could say, realist sense for Heidegger, right? That we acknowledge that we are beings in potential, right? We are always being possible. The problem is that doesn't answer very particulars. Being possible for what? So I can be a Nazi? Being possible to be a murderer? Being possible to do this? So I will say this. Heidegger is good in the sense of answering the problematic of being a slave without realizing that you are a slave to something. The next step is, if we realize that we're a slave, and Heidegger will help us realize that we're a slave to something, so then what's our next possibility? What do we then respond with? And that's where Heidegger, in my opinion, and I'm only in being in time, I know he goes much further in some works, he's silent on this because he doesn't give a kind of moral imposition here. The only moral, you could say, the only moral imposition is the possibility to be. And you are actually making me realize this is a very interesting insight that I'll have to, like, think about now a little bit more, is that I realize that it's not just Heidegger as a thinker that emphasizes freedom. It's Hegel, it's Lacan, like Discourse of the Master, and even, like, I think Kant. What I'm starting to realize is that a lot of things concerning ethics has to do with escaping domination.
Yes.
Not actually what we should do.
Yeah, they want to make a clearing because they think the moral state is to be in a condition of non-coercive and kind of release from external force, external obligation, force. And that's why things like attack, basically the challenge against tradition, all these things that impose demands on individuals, basically bracket and narrow down the range of possibility of activity, and therefore is not good. It's violence against the human substance. That's the argument. At least that's my read of it. I'm incredibly critical of that for many reasons. But that'd be my take in terms of what the argumentation here is trying to do.
So, and this is